She held the cup like it was just another thing she could own. I watched Kaylee swirl the last of the tea around the bottom, fine china hand-painted, passed down from my mother-in-law to me the year I got married. She didn't ask before taking it from the cabinet. She didn't notice the small hairline crack near the rim or the initials painted on the underside. She just set it down and said, "Your life means nothing. Don't embarrass us. Stay away." I didn't respond. Not out of shock I'd seen this coming, but because I didn't trust my voice to sound calm. So I just nodded once and took the empty cup back to the sink. The backyard they're using. Mine. The house she moved into. Still legally mine too. But somewhere between Nathan's silence and her confidence, I'd been quietly written out. When I asked about the guest list last week, Kaylee laughed. "It's mostly friends, social people, people who matter. Apparently, I don't." She walked out, then tapping at her phone, leaving her lipstick on porcelain that's older than she is. I stood at the window and watched her cross the lawn I mowed last summer, planning where the tent would go without asking me a single thing. Nathan came in later, phone in hand, distracted as always. "You okay?" he asked without looking up. I wiped the cup dry with a soft cloth. "Fine," I said. He kissed my cheek. "Big week. Try not to take things too personally." I didn't say a word. I didn't tell him I'd already seen the invitations, how they listed only one set of parents. I didn't mention what the florist said when she called the landline, "Will the homeowner be available that weekend?" Apparently not. Nathan left again, and the house was quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, holding that cup in both hands. The crack had widened, just slightly. You wouldn't see it unless you were looking for it. I put it back in the cabinet, back where it belonged, and turned toward the stairs. The day after Kaylee's comment, I found my pillow propped against the door of the garden shed. Nathan had carried it out there himself, along with a folded blanket and the lamp from my sewing table. He didn't make eye contact when he said, "Just for a little while, Mom?" The guest house is crowded with wedding stuff. The guest house. The small cottage I built for visiting family, the one with the big windows and the stone fireplace. It used to smell like my husband's pipe tobacco and cedar mulch from his workshop. Now it smelled like Kaylee's scented candles and the new rugs she bought without asking. They had taken over the main house first, then the guest house. The shed was all that was left. I stepped inside and looked around. A narrow cot, the lamp the kettle Nathan must have grabbed from the pantry. No closet, no shelves. The air was cooler than I expected, and for a moment, I had to remind myself to breathe. "I'll manage," I said quietly. Kaylee appeared behind Nathan, arms crossed, a bright smile glued on like she was posing for a picture. "It's temporary," she repeated, as if that made it kind. "We just need space to organize everything. You know how these big weddings are." I didn't. My own wedding was small, a backyard ceremony with a cake I baked and a dress Isabel helped me hem, but I nodded anyway. Later that afternoon, I carried my husband's antique desk out to the porch, intending to give it to them as a gift. He'd written every grocery list and birthday note on it for 30 years. I thought maybe it would mean something. Kaylee barely glanced at it. "Oh," she said, "that's sturdy. But we're doing mid-century modern, clean lines minimalism. You wouldn't get it." She said it the same way someone might talk to a child trying to hand them a crayon drawing. I slid the desk back inside, careful not to scrape the floor. Nathan didn't follow me. He stayed with her. That night, I lay in the shed, the lamp casting a weak yellow circle on the wall, and wondered when I became a visitor in my own life. The attic stairs creaked the same way they always had, a long wooden sigh under my feet. I carried my husband's old inventory ledger with me, its pages soft from years of being handled. He'd cataloged every family heirloom we owned, his way of making sure nothing meaningful was forgotten. I hadn't opened it in a long time, but tonight, with the shed still cold in my bones, I needed something that belonged to me again. On the second page, written in his careful handwriting, it read Isabel's wedding dress. Attic box number 3. I followed the note and found the box exactly where he'd said it would be, behind the old winter coats, the lid tied with twine my husband had knotted himself. Inside, the dress was wrapped in muslin the way Isabel taught me to store fabric meant to last. When I lifted it out, the lace felt fragile but warm, like it had held onto decades of hands. I held it up to the dim attic light, remembering how radiant Isabel had looked in it. Not because it was expensive, it wasn't, but because she'd stitched every seam with a quiet certainty that marriage was something built by 2 people, not purchased by a photographer. The next morning, I brought the dress to the guest house. Kaylee was arranging sample bouquets on the kitchen counter. I waited until she finished snapping a picture before I spoke. "I thought you might want this," I said, unfolding the muslin. She blinked once, then let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Oh, that's quaint." I folded the muslin back over the lace, but she kept talking. "I want something that reflects my future, not your past. I'm going to the boutique downtown." Nathan stood behind her, silent again. I carried the dress back to the attic afterward. I didn't cry. I just placed it gently in the box and tied the twine back into a knot. That night, my phone buzzed on the cot. A charge alert lit up the screen, $12.800 Bridal Elegance Boutique. A purchase made on a card I'd co-signed long before I knew how much it would cost me. The rehearsal dinner list was printed on thick paper, the kind people use when they want something to feel more important than it is. It arrived in an envelope addressed to Nathan and Kaylee, but Nathan handed it to me like he thought it might soften something between us. "Mom, you should see this," he muttered. I opened it at the kitchen counter, hoping to see my name somewhere. I wasn't looking for a place of honor. A seat in the back would have been enough. But the list was tidy and complete, and I wasn't on it. Not even as an afterthought. Before I could ask, Nathan rubbed the back of his neck and avoided my eyes. "Kaylee's family thinks your presence would complicate the dynamic." I stared at him. What dynamic? His silence answered everything he was too afraid to say out loud. I set the list down, careful not to wrinkle it, and walked to the living room. My old photo album was on the bottom shelf, exactly where I'd left it years ago. Weddings from our family, from neighbors, from friends who had since moved across the country. Real celebrations, people holding hands instead of phones. Brides with smudged mascara from laughing too much. Grooms who didn't care whether the candlesticks matched the napkins. I flipped through the pages one by one. No stylists or photographers with curated followings. No rented champagne arches. No sponsors. No hashtags. No performance. On Kaylee and Nathan's guest list, not one of these people appeared. Instead, there were names of makeup artists she'd met once at an event, a photographer who charged more than I earned my first year of marriage, and a handful of people known more for their online presence than their actual presence in anyone's life. Kaylee hadn't built a wedding. She'd built a backdrop. I closed the album and set it beside the sleek rehearsal list, 2 versions of the same milestone separated by decades, but farther apart than that in meaning. The paper felt cold in my hands. Outside, I could hear Kaylee directing a delivery driver where to stack the boxes of decorations, her voice full of certainty about a world I no longer recognized. And as I listened, a different certainty settled quietly into me, leading me toward what I knew I had to do next. I waited until the house was quiet before opening my laptop. The shed was too dim to work in, and I didn't want Kaylee hovering over my shoulder, so I sat at the dining table, the same one where my husband and I once planned birthday parties and grocery lists. Now, it held Kaylee's color swatches and stacks of glossy brochures. I pushed them aside and logged into the bank portal. The joint credit line appeared first. It was supposed to be an emergency fund, something Nathan could use during college if his old truck broke down, or if he needed a plane ticket home. I never imagined it would become the backbone of someone else's wedding fantasy. The list of charges scrolled longer than I expected. Tent rentals, champagne towers, designer heels with names I didn't recognize, his and hers robes from a luxury spa, a deposit for a string quartet, a makeup trial costing more than my monthly groceries. All of it drawn from a line of credit tied directly to my name. Tens of thousands of dollars. My signature at the bottom of every agreement, even ones I'd never seen. I sat back, letting it settle. Then I clicked the button that closed the account permanently. No explanation. No warning. Just a clean break. Afterward, I reached for the drawer beneath the table, the one where my husband used to keep documents he said were too important to lose. Inside was the trust packet he set up years before he passed a plan for our land, if anything ever happened to either of us. I had never needed it. Until now. The papers were crisp, the ink still bold. My name stood alone beside the title, Trustee of Tate Acreage. I traced the lettering with my thumb, remembering how he told me, half joking, "If push ever comes to shove, this land will listen to you before it listens to anyone else." And here we were. Push had come. Shove was on its way. I flipped through the pages, reading every clause. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me I had full authority over how the property was used or who had access to it. The wedding was set to take place on my land. And for the first time, I realized that meant something entirely different than they thought. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I didn't bother going into the house. I knew Kaylee would already be rehearsing instructions for delivery drivers, and Nathan would be trailing behind her, trying not to look overwhelmed. Instead, I walked straight to the shed and sat on the edge of the cot with my phone in my hand. The county planning office opened at 8. I called at 8:01. I gave the clerk my name, the parcel number, and the date of the scheduled event. I could hear her flipping through digital files, her keyboard tapping lightly. "Ma'am," she said. After a few seconds, "The permit is under your authority. Are you calling to confirm attendance numbers?" "No," I answered. "I'm calling to revoke it." There was a short pause. "Revoke? The entire permit?" "Yes." I heard more typing then. The final decisive click of approval. That was it. Months of their planning undone with a quiet administrative adjustment. No argument, no drama, just a form reverting to its owner. Within the hour, emails began arriving, first from the rental company, then the caterer, then the quartet. Each message had the same tone: confusion, then formality, then withdrawal. Without permits, without access, without guarantees, none of them could proceed. And without my financial authorization, none of them would be paid. By the time the fourth cancellation notice came through, footsteps crunched outside the shed. Nathan pushed the door open without knocking. "Mom," he said, his voice already strained. "What's going on?" "Vendors are calling Kaylee non-stop." "Did you cancel everything?" I folded the last printed email and placed it on the small table beside me. "No," I said. "I just stopped funding what I never agreed to." He stared at me like I'd spoken in a language he'd forgotten how to understand. "But the wedding people are arriving tomorrow." "I know," I said. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small doorway. "Kaylee is furious. She says you're sabotaging her. You need to talk to her." But I didn't move. I didn't argue. I simply watched him realize how little control he actually had. Outside, another email pinged a notice from the venue itself, pulling out of the agreement entirely. And with that sound still hanging in the air, I stood up and reached for my coat, ready to take the next step I knew I needed to take. By the time Kaylee's first guests arrived, the gravel drive was already lined with expensive cars. People in tailored suits and pastel dresses stood beside rental SUVs checking their phones, and murmuring to each other, confused. The tent was gone. The catering van never showed. The floral arch Nathan paid for with my credit line never made it past the county's revoked permit list. At the gate, a printed sign was zip-tied to the post, "Private property. No access without owner consent. Trespassing will be reported." I hadn't added my name. I didn't need to. From where I sat behind the barn, I could hear the slow build of panic. Voices rising, phones ringing. Someone shouting about contracts. Another asking where the bathrooms were. A woman in heels cursing the dust. Somewhere in the mix, Kaylee's voice, sharp, high-pitched, trying to hold it all together like a bouquet that kept slipping from her hands. I didn't move. I stayed where I was, next to the rusted wheelbarrow, sipping from a mug of coffee I'd brewed on the small stove in the shed. The barn always had better shade this time of day. Nathan found me about 20 minutes later. His shoes were dusty shirt, half-untucked hair flattened like he'd pulled at it one too many times. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said out of breath, like I'd somehow outrun him in his own story. I looked at him. Just looked. He swallowed hard. "You embarrassed us. You made a scene." "No," I said. I removed myself from one. He stepped closer. "Kaylee's parents are furious. People came from all over. And not one of them thought to ask why the woman who owns this land wasn't on the guest list." He hesitated. It was complicated. "No," I said again. "It was convenient." I stood, slowly brushing off the back of my skirt. "When did I stop being your mother, Nathan?" I asked quietly. "And become your bank?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the dirt hands useless at his sides. Behind us, another car door slammed. More guests, more questions. And I knew then it was only beginning. By late afternoon, the cars were leaving as quickly as they had arrived. I watched them turn around at the gate, a few tires kicking up dry dust, as guests realized there would be no ceremony, no cocktail hour, no staged sunset photo shoot. Some of them glanced back toward the house, with squinting eyes waiting for someone to explain. But no one did. I heard Kaylee yelling before I saw her. Her voice carried through the open windows of the guest house, accusing, indignant. "You said your mother would stay out of the way. You promised me," she shouted. Nathan's voice came next lower but cracking under pressure. "I didn't think she'd do this. I thought she'd let it go. Let it go." That's what it had always come down to with him. He wanted me quiet. Accepting. Willing to be forgotten so long as it made things easier. They argued until the sun began to slip behind the trees. Then came the silence. What neither of them realized was that the neighbors had been watching all day. Old friends. Farmhands I'd hired years ago. Families who'd shared holidays with us before Kaylee ever entered the picture. And now, word was spreading. She banned his mother from her own land. That's her place, isn't it? Always was. I heard the whole wedding was paid for on Marlon's card. By evening, the story was out. Not mine, theirs. Nathan came back to the shed just before dusk, hands in his pockets, looking more boy than man. "I'll fix this," he said quietly. I turned to him steady. "You already did," I said. "You showed me where I stand." He opened his mouth like he had something else to say. But whatever it was, he couldn't find the shape of it. So he stood there instead, still as stone, and watched me close the shed door behind me. I walked past him across the field toward the main house. The porch creaked the way it always had beneath my steps. I unlocked the front door. Not for him, not for anyone else, but because I had something to finish inside. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't write a note or leave instructions on the fridge. I just moved through the house one last time, opening drawers, checking closets, touching the corners of rooms where laughter once lived. I packed what I needed into 2 suitcases and a canvas tote clothes, documents, a few photographs, and my sewing kit. The rest stayed. The antique desk remained in the corner of the study, polished and still. I dusted it with the sleeve of my sweater, before locking the drawer that held the last letter my husband wrote to me. The wedding dress, still wrapped in muslin, rested in the cedar chest upstairs. And the inventory ledger, his handwriting steady as ever, sat neatly on the bookshelf, its spine aligned with all the other volumes we never got around to reading. I didn't sell the house. I didn't list it. I didn't leave a forwarding address for agents or contractors. Instead, I drove into town and walked into the office of the Allegheny Valley Land Trust. The woman at the front desk offered me coffee while I filled out the forms. No residence, no events, no short-term occupancy, no entry without written consent from the trustee me. The land would be preserved untouched for 3 years. That meant no wedding redos, no backyard brunches for online followers, no photo shoots among the orchard trees, just silence. I returned that evening with the signed documents and a new set of keys. I locked every door, drew every curtain, and placed the notarized copy of the trust restriction in the center of the dining table. Then I slipped my own key into a small envelope and tucked it into the back pocket of my bag. The gate closed behind me with a clean, metallic click. I didn't look back. As I merged onto the highway with the last light of day fading behind the hills, I thought about everything I'd left inside those walls and everything I hadn't. There was still one more thing to deliver, one more gift that belonged not to them, but to someone who might still understand its worth. The town was smaller than I remembered, tucked between wooded hills and wide sky. I rented a room above an old hardware store, the kind that still smelled like oil and pine shavings, and walked to the corner bakery each morning for coffee. No one knew my name, and for once I didn't mind. Within a month, I found a storefront with good light. The windows faced east, and by noon, the floor was warm beneath my feet. I filled it slowly, bolts of fabric in quiet colors, baskets of thread, a single wooden table in the center, with space enough to breathe. I named it The New Pattern, and never put my full name on the sign. The quilts I made were stitched from memory, not patterns. One had a border that matched my mother's apron. Another used scraps from the curtains that used to hang in our sunroom. I didn't label them. I didn't explain their stories. I let the cloth speak in its own quiet language. Some customers came in, curious, others quiet. A few just ran their hands across the seams and said, "Thank you," without buying a thing. That was enough. One afternoon, I sealed a large box and mailed it to my lawyer back home. Inside was the wedding dress, still wrapped in muslin, still hand-stitched. I included a short note. "Please deliver this to the women's shelter in town. Let it find someone who needs to believe in starting over." I didn't sign the card. That night, I sat at the table in the back of the shop, lit a single lamp, and pulled a new length of cotton from the shelf. I ran my fingers across the fabric, then reached for a needle and began to thread it. No initials, no legacy, no apology. Just motion, just cloth, just peace. Outside, the wind shifted. A bell above the door chimed softly as someone passed by, unaware of the woman stitching her new life one silent seam at a time.